All right, welcome to the Precision Protocol series brought to you by Biocanic. I'm Jeremy Malecha, and I am joined by my brilliant co-host, Brendan Vermeire. In this series, we're always going to nerd out on the world of personalized health, functional medicine, clinical research, and cutting-edge wellness strategies. We'll be exploring the advanced science, clinical applications, and the real-world impact of precision protocols designed to optimize client outcomes. Welcome, Brendan. How you doing?
Good, man. How are you doing today?
Awesome. Well, today we're going to be tackling a topic that's now finally made it into the mainstream conversation, shit. More specifically, we'll be talking about stool microbiome testing, its practical applications to you and your clients, and we're going to dissect the various testing methodologies. There's a lot of confusion out there. The markers, how to use and interpret them in the context of your clinical clients. So let's get ready for the deep dive into this essential topic for anyone serious about elevating their clinical practice for their clients. So on the Bristol stool chart, this is going to be a type 7 in that we're going to be fast and loose in our conversation. So let's get started right now. All right, Brendan. Okay, let's talk about stool microbiome testing. Let's just tackle the basics if you want to just kick it off.
Yeah, well, even kind of recapping like the biological age conversation we had last time, I think this will translate well because even since that conversation, I saw some clips on social media where like a practitioner was like, oh, well, my functional doctor ran this biological test and looked like I'm so much younger than I actually am. And, kind of, crutching as if that's a reliable data point. So I'm glad we're doing this series so we can kind of suss out what's valid, what's not, what's characterized in the literature, and especially with, I think, the hyper commercialization of the stool testing, all the at-home kits and the new sequencing technologies. And of course, I think everybody in just our industry and kind of the wellness space has adopted the idea of gut health, ground zero for overall health. And certainly I even was starting to hear from other kind of non-professionals of like, why is everybody all of a sudden identifying as a gut specialist? And it's like, well, because it's kind of a big deal. So it's usually considered a foundational assessment for most practitioners. So I think as we kind of break down the different technologies, it'll be a great empowering conversation.
Yeah, I mean, I remember, maybe you can share yours, but my first stool test was I think it was a BioHealth. Was it a 205 or 401?
401H, yeah.
Yeah, and it was very difficult. I think you had to freeze it, and then you're like, you're taking your stool sample, you're putting it in the fridge next to your leftovers, and then you have to ship it with dry ice. It's way different now. I think that was 2016. So let's kind of just jump into the different testing methodologies.
Yeah, I mean, back in the day, I was all about the blood work, and I didn't even know some of these stool tests or urine tests or all these other things existed. And so, classically, the stool testing was like the ova and parasite examination with just microscopy technology of the parasitologist that's, looking at the stool sample under a microscope to actually see if they can visibly find any sort of bug parts or the trichrome stain that was part of the 401H or the antigen screening. But it was around that kind of 2016 mark that then the sequencing really hit the market with PCR or then shotgun metagenomics. And I don't even remember there's this original lab that I was using for a while that was using quantitative PCR along with some other markers. But then the GI map kind of became like the popular one that everybody started running to. But I think breaking down, I think it's helpful to delineate between the different types of technology of microbiome sequencing, more so referring to, of course, the sequencing of the microbial genome, the microbiome, right? And we can do that with primarily either a PCR-based technology or then the shotgun metagenomics, which are the primary two. So we have this category of, microbiome sequencing, and that's different than intestinal physiological biomarkers, things like calprotect and lactoferrin. But then now too, we have this kind of third category that is all the different metabolites that the microbiota can produce and synthesize, and using things like mass spectrometry to measure those metabolites. So when we're talking about commercial stool testing, it's usually kind of some combination of all of those, but they play different roles in a clinical setting. And some of those biomarkers are better established in the literature, whereas other data points we don't really know yet.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think just kind of touching back on some of the words you dropped there. So the microscopy was literally somebody looking at the stool under a microscope, and that was the original. And then I think even on like yeast calculations. If it was like a 1, 2, 3, or 4, it was how much it actually grew on the actual test medium. And then kind of introduce the PCR technology where it was just either positive or negative. And now with qPCR or quantitative PCR, it is actually giving you a numeric value. So oftentimes when we kind of look longitudinally, we had those microscopies, then we had PCR positive or negative for something. And now we can actually see something like, for example, H. pylori is 1,283 versus just positive and or negative.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and it kind of shifts so even in the literature, I have a few excerpts that I include in my course that are essentially stating, and I'll give my opinion first, which is I think we're in this place where our technology has greatly surpassed our understanding, but it is the technological leaps that will then allow us to capture the data points to try to establish clinical significance. Because in the world of microbiome research, the big thing that they're trying to do is, kind of map and determine like, well, what should the human microbiome look like, right? Looking at the word dysbiosis, which we all know and understand as this sort of cryptic, vague, like, well, dysbiosis, there's an imbalance of, good and bad microbes in the colon. But then how do we really define what the human microbiome should look like hasn't been established. There's, general characteristics. And so with the whole genome sequencing or then PCR, different technologies are still just aimed of, well, what microbes can we actually detect the genetic content for in that stool sample, and how many of these are permanently engrafted or kind of colonized within the intestinal lumen versus maybe are they just passing through. And so that's part of the nuance of stool testing is even they've looked at like, fungal populations, as you were just alluding to. And it's like, well, the fungal populations aren't even detected in everybody. So we have this like highly sensitive technology, but there's still a lot more research to be done to really unpack microbial composition patterns and what does that mean in regards to clinical outcomes and trajectories.
Yeah, and I always emphasize this with a lot of our practitioners who are asking questions, which you kind of touched on itself, which is, they'll say, well, you're above the normal range, right? And so for each individual testing company, they have quote unquote their normal range, which may be, a couple hundred to 1,000 people. But I would challenge anybody like yourself, find 5 friends that don't have a GI issue. And is that normal? Or is it maybe they just aren't aware of it, right? So what is actually a normal microbiome that you should be comparing to, right?
Yeah, exactly. I mean, there's the general characteristics, right? Like if there's one thing that's pretty well characterized in the copious amounts of microbiome research from all over the world, it's really that diversity is king. It's one of the few things that I feel like is clearly defined of greater diversity is associated with better health and better health outcomes. But that's still a relatively vague thing. And then how do we sort of quantify or capture diversity? So, alpha diversity as more the quantity, the absolute quantity of species that were detected in the sample. And then, beta diversity more as the species richness. So kind of how many microbes are at the party in your gut, but then what's the quality and what are they doing in there? And so it's been interesting, even just over the past almost 10 years of seeing these big leaps with the technology and the sequencing. But to your point, all these labs are kind of creating their own established ranges based on the technology or how they plot that information. Because when you really look at like how much data is collected with the sequencing versus how much is even being reported or plotted on the report, it's really disproportionate, especially with whole genome sequencing. So in the research settings, it's like, where are we using the technology more for kind of a specific pathogen identification, which is where like the qPCR for, COVID, for example, it was all the PCR rapid test because, well, we know exactly what we're looking for. And this is an accurate technology to do that versus then with something that's so expansive, like this ecosystem that lives in our colon of, well, we're trying to kind of detect everything and anything that's in there to try to determine some degree of clinical significance.
Yeah. So maybe let's just kind of touch on the three buckets, 16S, the shotgun, and then the whole genome. And maybe talk about a couple of brands in each one of those buckets, and then maybe talk through how each one would differ from each other.
Yeah, so I'd love to take like a tour of a lab and have a lab tech school me on the machinery and everything. But to my understanding, with the PCR machine, it's basically like a heating and cooling system. It's going to heat up to anneal and sort of denature and break the DNA into single strands, and then they have this sort of PCR mix of enzymes, nucleotides, to essentially create copies of the gene. So they're amplifying it over and over and over to be able to identify, what is this and what bacterial species. So the 16S rRNA, that's a specific gene within a highly conserved gene within bacteria that all bacteria have. And so the 16S is really only for bacteria and maybe archaea. I'd need to double check the notes on that one. But then there's all these other technologies like 18S, which is better for just kind of eukaryotic organisms in general, or then ITS, which is the superior PCR technology for fungi and identifying more microbiome. But then with whole genome sequencing, which is essentially the desired outcome of trying to map out the entire genetic content that was identified in that stool sample. So whole genome sequencing is often kind of referred to as a technology, but it's really the endpoint that we're using shotgun metagenomics to try to get to. My basic understanding of shotgun metagenomics is it's like they blow apart the genetic content and like reassemble it to identify all of the microbial genetic content present. And essentially, it's once they have the genetic content, they're relating it back to like a microbial genome library of tons of data to identify everything that's there. And so the shotgun metagenomics is often considered the superior technology, but it depends on, well, what is it being used for? What are we trying to accomplish? But for the sake of human microbiome research, where we want to identify all the microbes present in that sample down to the strain level. So having that really high resolution, because usually the PCR can only go down to, maybe the species level, whereas then with the whole genome sequencing, we can actually identify and delineate various strains within that species. So it's a much more broad encapsulation of data, way more data, which makes it more expensive, more cumbersome from a processing and result standpoint, which is why most of the commercial labs are really relying on the PCR, but then it becomes limited with a predefined list of microbes that they were looking for the genetic content for. So like GI-MAP is a great example, or some of the others that it's a predefined list of here's the microbes that we're looking for. Using the quantitative PCR, that at least can create some degree of quantifiable data. But even then, we don't know if something's detected as being present, we don't really know if it's dead or alive. We don't know if it's metabolically viable or proliferative or pathogenic, or if it's just dead and there. So it kind of makes comparing like pre and post testing a little bit tricky in the interpretation.
Yeah. So maybe let's just cover quickly bucket them. So 16S typical PCR would be kind of GI-MAP, GIFX, correct?
Mm-hmm.
And then both of them have some microscopy associated with them?
Yeah, so the DSL GI-MAP is the qPCR, and then I know GIFX, they're using the 16S and I think qPCR, but then they also do the microscopy. And they also, I think this is more recent, they have an add-on that you can do for an additional cost, where then they'll do the shotgun metagenomics on top of all of that. So that's the GIFX is the only one that I know of as of right now that's kind of combining all these different sequencing technologies in one. So if you want like PCR plus shotgun sequencing plus, the stool biomarkers as well. So that's kind of the big thing. And I'm relatively impartial and I have no financial incentive to like one or the other, but some of the tests are stronger in certain realms, like the gut zoomer has tons of intestinal biomarkers, or the BiomeFX is using the shotgun metagenomics. So it's kind of like, well, we want to try to capture as much sequencing compositional data as possible, but I would almost argue from a clinical perspective, like, well, the clinical biomarkers of digestion and inflammation are perhaps more valuable, because then we're trying to draw parallels between those two. So practitioners have to be thinking about, well, which test is going to give me which information, and what information do I need to effectively guide the client, right? All the while trying to make it cost effective.
Yeah, for sure. So, and we kind of touched on this a little bit. I think shotgun sequencing is also Viome, if I'm correct. And then I think
so.
There's the Thorn longevity platform, which I think is the whole genome. And I think the reference lab is Cosmos ID, or that one as well. So maybe kind of thinking about the practical application of this. So let's talk to maybe a couple case studies, that you've seen, and how the stool microbiome testing has informed, what would you look for on it if somebody showed up today, constant GI issues, emergency room, emergency antibiotics type of thing. What would you run, from a testing perspective? And then what are you looking for from a correlative standpoint from those particular markers?
Yeah. I mean, if I kind of imagine like the classic gut-brain axis type of client or phenotype, I picture somebody that from a clinical presentation, maybe they've been diagnosed IBS or IBD, or they just have overt GI symptoms in general, dysmotility and bloating, abdominal pain, indigestion, all these things. But then the systemic issues, maybe some musculoskeletal pain would be a red flag, chronic fatigue would be a red flag, anxiety, depression, anhedonia, or lack of pleasure, especially when we have that type of symptom cluster that certainly screams gut-brain axis. So then with that, it's like, I'm biased. I'm going to start with a lot of blood work, looking at various neuroimmune and inflammatory immune markers, but then using the stool testing of like, okay, but what's going on in the gut? And I will say, like a case that comes to mind, one of my clients, what was really cool about her case study was we actually used a number of different stool tests over the course of time. And we did retest more than one. So that way we had kind of apples to apples, regardless of the assay that we were using. So we had done like a couple Biome effects, a couple gut zoomer, maybe even a GI map in there somewhere. But it was cool to see. I mean, there were incongruencies, but there were other aspects that looked good. And even because I was trying to play around with how to make this as cost effective as possible, at one point we had done a stool sample just through LabCorp to run calprotectin, lactoferrin, elastase, and steatocrit, just core GI physiological biomarkers. Because the thing is, I mean, if we back up for a second, like, why do we even really care about the microbiome or its composition or what bugs are present? It's like, well, because we care about how that ecosystem is impacting host physiology. So if we're not really directly assessing the host physiology using established intestinal markers or systemic markers, it's really hard to draw parallels between the composition and what bugs are present or what are they doing versus then the clinical interface of, well, what's going on with host physiology. So, I mean, in an ideal world, this client I was thinking about, the calprotectin that we ran through LabCorp was like 120. So kind of an IBS range, certainly not, in the thousands, but high enough that it's definitely elevated for a fecal calprotectin. And what was really, really cool is we had done a Biome FX on that same stool sample. So, some of the stool went to LabCorp just to run the chemistry markers. And then some of the stool went to microbiome labs to do the whole genome sequencing. And so that was a cool case study where we saw, the elevated calprotectin that correlated with his compositional data showing really, really reduced diversity and phyla imbalances. Because, thinking of that microbiome as an ecosystem and looking at some of the higher level data points, I think one of the problems practitioners run into is they're kind of getting a little bit too myopic of like, well, this bug showed up or this bug. And it becomes like a game of microbial whack-a-mole. You're trying to like eliminate bugs from a sequencing test. Whereas I think we have to more so think about, okay, you're on the ground with a magnifying glass on the rainforest floor. We need to get up in the helicopter and fly over the rainforest to see if there's deforestation or inflammation and the rainforest is on fire. So that's more looking at like diversity in the phyla ratios of the major phyla that constitute the human microbiota, rather than being so myopically zoomed in on this one little bug. So we have to assess the host physiology, look at the microbiome composition, see how that correlates. And then I'll end this monologue with when we retested some of those markers a while later, her biome effects showed that we improved her alpha diversity by like 51 species, as in there were 51 more microbial species in her gut upon retest than it was about a year prior. And the calprotectin, again through LabCorp, different lab entirely, went from 120 down to 18. So that was a good N of 1 case study that showed, well, as we improve the composition and improve diversity, we also concomitantly decrease intestinal inflammation. And that's an idea of kind of the working picture that we want to get ideally.
Yeah, maybe just, you kind of went through them quickly. Maybe it sounds like you kind of start with the intestinal health markers and then you look at the next layer down. Maybe just kind of talk about those key markers and what each one of those actually represent.
100%. I think we kind of have to anchor this to the GI clinical biomarkers. And it's a little wild because even in the conventional system, like they'll order a colonoscopy long before they're going to do a non-invasive fecal calprotectin, even though research shows that the non-invasive calprotectin correlates very well with endoscopy and colonoscopy. So, calprotectin being really the gold standard of GI inflammation, fecal lactoferrin would be kind of like the silver standard, pretty well established. And then we have all these new players, the beta defensin 2 or MMP9 and lysozyme and others. But, I'm always the type of guy, like, we have to go with weight of evidence. So if this biomarker has way more evidence behind it, we're going to put more weight of how we interpret that. But yeah, to your point then of the microbiome sequencing, it's kind of one of those, like, it's nice to have, but it's not really as essential, because for me, I care about, are their intestines inflamed? Are they leaky? Are they digesting and absorbing their food? And I technically don't really need to know much about their microbiome composition to be able to, intervene upon that, right? Because of course we can do all the diet and exercise and supplementation strategies to, build up and propagate a healthy, diverse microbiota. But I can just track those intestinal physiology markers to see, are we moving in the right direction? Is inflammation going down as measured by lactoferrin, calprotectin, and others? Is digestion stabilizing with, steatocrit and elastase outputs? But that's kind of I think that's the goal. I can't speak for the owners of these functional laboratories, but I would think that that's ultimately the goal, is to draw parallels between those established clinical biomarkers and their sequencing. But there's debate about how reliable and reproducible the sequencing really is. There's risk of false positive, risk of false negative. And to your point, like if you ran 5 tests from 5 different companies on the same stool sample, are you going to get compositional data that is at all similar?
Yeah. And that was one of the earlier tests that I ran. I did a GI map, a longevity, and a BiomeFX all on the same day, on the same stool sample in the same spot. And I did get, I call it 80% overlap, but then there was 20% that was completely different. The interesting thing that did come up was that at the time, both BiomeFX and longevity were using the same laboratory to provide the data, but one was using the laboratory for the interpretation. The other one was taking the raw data, providing their own interpretation. So it literally was coming from the same lab on the same equipment, from the same sample, from the same person. Yet I got 2 different interpretations because of the different methodologies for how they were going through it. I remember BiomeFX, my B vitamins were super low, like on the left-hand side of the bar. And then the exact same data interpretation was showing B vitamins high.
Mm-hmm.
Right. And so those are the types of kind of nuances, just even within a kind of a controlled N of 1, you can get variability. And then also because of my health history, I've run longitudinal GI maps over time, and you can just see transient variability.
Mm-hmm.
Like I happen to have elevated secretory anti-gliadin in it. It coincided with me taking the stool test on a Tuesday and having gotten glutened at a restaurant 2 days before. But you can see my anti-gliadin IgA relatively low. It spiked at one time, but obviously it resolved itself by the end of the week as my body was able to adapt.
Yeah, I mean, this is where I know you and I have kind of a shared passion, and the real world data becomes that much more important, because it's hard to control for some of these. Like even right now, I've been talking to this group, and we're looking at maybe doing this kind of gut-brain axis study that we're sort of co-creating. But then the idea would be, it's like, well, we have the cohort, literally come to like a pop-up city, you know, where it's like, well, everything's being changed, the geography, the terrain, like their lifestyle, their nutrition. I mean, if they're going from their home to wherever they're building this pop-up city to do the test, it's like that's so many variables that are being intervened upon, and then trying to look at the compositional shifts. But to your point too, like we had said, I mean, a lot of these reports, the amount of data is huge, and they can only really report so much of it. But you mentioned like the vitamin synthesis too, because that's a major delineating factor of why would you choose like a whole genome sequencing test versus the PCR. Is the whole genome sequencing is looking at different functional genes that relate to various metabolic functions, like the ability to produce short chain fatty acids or polyamines or indoles and things like that. So some of the shotgun metagenomic testing will create basically like an estimation of, well, based on the microbes and the composition that we identified in your sample, what is the genetic propensity that this microbiome would be able to produce adequate levels? So then it's giving like an estimation of, you know, butyrate production or acetate or hydrogen sulfide gas, but it's not measuring those things directly. You know, it's not a replacement for like a SIBO breath test. It's not directly measuring the short chain fatty acids, whereas some of the other tests do. They'll use like gas chromatography, mass spectrometry, or liquid chromatography mass spec to measure the bile acids and the short chain fatty acids directly, which personally I would rather have the direct measurement rather than sort of the genetic propensity estimation, you know?
Yeah, for sure. So maybe let's talk a little bit about, okay, so you've got somebody that's got a microbiome test that's lit up. Kind of where do you start, right? So we want to restore the diversity, right? There's obviously very high quality probiotics. You know, we hear people that'll say, oh, I see Akkermansia as 0. And so I'm going to start them just on Akkermansia as a supplement. And then you've got the kind of the other side of the table, which is the Mark Hyman, oh, just eat the rainbow and everything will be fine type of thing. How do you kind of think about kind of restoring that restoration when that client's in front of you?
You know, I love the spectrum that you just painted there, because it's like, I know tons of practitioners that they do get a little bit too myopic, and it becomes that unfortunate game of kind of microbial whack-a-mole. And I see this way too often. I think it's just kind of a little bit of a novice oversight of, you know, the human mind. We want things to be simple. So you would think like, okay, I run this stool sample, you know, here's the bugs that were detected at these quantities, it's quantifiable. So then of course you would think that, hey, if I do some kind of antimicrobial microbiome landscaping type protocol, if you will, then you'd sort of expect like, oh, well, if I did the parasite cleanse, the parasite shouldn't be detected on the retest. And if the practitioner doesn't realize the nuances of the technology or the fact that we don't know if it's dead or alive, like maybe the protocol was successful and maybe it killed all of those parasites, but the genetic content is still potentially there and detectable and quantifiable, right? So that makes the interpretation a little bit tricky, which is why, you know, I'm teaching practitioners of looking at the general characteristics. So like the phyla ratios are, in my mind, more important than the individual species being detected. Like, you know, GI map is a little bit more of a kind of selected pathogen criteria checklist of, well, here's the major potential pathogens and opportunistic species at what quantities, versus then like biome effects, more so trying to characterize the rainforest and the ecosystem. And so, you know, what we want to try to do is optimize the diversity metrics. Usually the Simpson's or Shannon's index is how those are reported on most tests, or then just alpha beta diversity. Because to me, it's really cool, like that case study I alluded to, if we can actually measure the alpha diversity and report that as a direct number of species, and seeing that go up is really, really cool, as opposed to like, well, this pathogen wasn't detected this time, but now this other one was. You know, you see that all the time if somebody might do a parasite cleanse or antimicrobial cleanse, but then sort of like the pathogens that they in their mind were targeting with the protocol are either like still there or maybe sometimes higher upon retest. And then the practitioner, you know, is sitting there kind of feeling like a chump because their client is like, well, hey, you just ran me through this expensive protocol and the bug is still there. But we have to look at, well, but did symptoms improve? And perhaps more importantly, did some of the physiological biomarkers improve? Like if the calprotectin went from 200 to 20, that's a huge win. And that's objective. That's really strong data. Whereas the compositional data might be a little all over. So I usually encourage practitioners focus on the diversity metrics first, and the phyla ratios. I think pretty much all of them at this point report the Firmicutes to Bacteroidetes ratio, and those are the two dominant phyla of the human microbiome, making up like 90% of everybody's microbiota, which is really interesting because there's over 70 phyla of bacteria known to man, and yet every single one of us, 8 billion people, it's dominated by the Firmicutes bacteroidetes, as well as then the proteobacteria to actinobacteria phyla ratios as well. So in an ideal world, pre to post, pre-protocol, post retest, I want to see diversity go up. I want to see inflammation go down. I want to see digestive markers improve. And as far as the individual species that did or did not pop up, to me, I take that with a lot of salt. I'm more concerned about the physiological trend rather than the compositional trend, if that makes sense.
Yeah. I was actually going to pull up my GI map data. Let's see if I can get that. And I got to add it to the stage. Awesome. Oh, it was there. There we go. So I've been you can see this is when GI map launched qPCR all the way back in 2018. But you can see like I have just generally transiently high bacillus. So I feel great. So it's probably not something to, it's like one of those things you don't really want to dig into too much. But I always wanted to kind of show, certain transient things have happened over time. You can see back in December, some other issues. I have H. pylori that kind of varies, but it's generally non-zero. But this was the funny one that I was giving the guys over at Cellcore hell about. So this is blasto. It's always been zero. And I started that Cellcore protocol. I have shared this before. I ultimately passed a parasite, but this is something where you actually see an increase of something that you would be concerned about, but I'm also inside of a protocol. And so that was kind of an interesting experience because now potentially I may have been retaining it and now actually excreting it through that individual protocol itself.
Yeah, I mean, see, this is the kind of stuff that, like, throughout my coming up in this industry, it wasn't really intuitive. But then when you really dig into it, I mean, this is what inspired my comment of our technology surpassed our understanding. Because then, too, it's like, okay, we have these really cool technologies that can, measure all these microbes down to the strain level or quantify the genetic content. But then, like, well, what does it really mean? And especially with the microbiome research expanding. So especially like Blastocystis hominis and H. pylori as great examples here. Both of those are starting to now be kind of reconsidered as, well, maybe they're commensals. Like they're not always bad, right? And so that's been a big part of it. Of first, we had this kind of broad spectrum of germ theory, terrain theory, and of course, with polarization, the truth is always somewhere in the middle. But then now it's even more so of looking at some of these kind of classically labeled parasites. They're harmful to the host and benefiting off of our life force, if you will. But then now emerging research is showing blasto and H. pylori, or then you look at like helminth therapy, worm therapy, where, they'll inoculate people with autoimmunity and see remission of autoimmune conditions from putting microbes, putting worms in their body. So completely challenges our perspective on all these critters. And, are they symbionts? Are they parasites? And then our ability to accurately detect them. So that's why I always kind of urge a little bit of caution to practitioners of don't immediately try to like treat the test results and kill all the bugs and wipe them all out, because we don't understand how they're all interacting with one another through this dynamic ecosystem. But we can obviously track the physiology and symptomatology, and then how that really correlates or not with the composition and the who's who is present. That's kind of a different thing that we need more research around.
Yeah. And this last one, I just showed the occult blood that showed positive. So being over the age of 40, that was kind of a red flag for me. When actually did the Cologuard, came back negative, and you can see that in my next test, it actually came down. But to your earlier point around kind of the non-invasive testing, this was a great way to kind of get that insight and be like, oh, wait, maybe there's something I need to dive in a little bit deeper on. Ultimately didn't matter, but I do have a family history of polyps, both my mom and my dad's side. So it's something to kind of take to the next level. And this is really why those health markers can really be a great indication as well.
It's funny that you mentioned the Cologuard, because I was just recording for a course the other day, and I mentioned Cologuard just like I did in our conversation about the biological age of imagine the day we have CGMs, that are continuous blood chemistry monitors. Same thing. Imagine when they make something like Cologuard or something similar, that it's able to analyze the microbiome composition on like a day-to-day real time basis, or all of your intestinal inflammatory markers and stuff. I was watching a movie on a plane that kind of joked about that, where it was like in the future, and they're having like pod babies and stuff, but their toilets, it's like, okay, they go have a bowel movement, and the toilet is like analyzing their microbiome composition and reporting it through the Alexa in the house of like, hey, your diversity was increased by 7% today, good job. But imagine when you have that real-time data, because it's like you take a round of antibiotics and kind of lays waste to the garden, but then how much does it bounce back? And I will say on that point, I do have some degree of confidence in microbiome sequencing, because I have seen plenty of N of 1 and then times however many consults I've done. But I've seen plenty of times where it's like somebody might do a whole genome sequencing, and then we see how their alpha diversity is destroyed after a round of antibiotics. And I've seen that enough times, I feel pretty confident that there's some degree of reliability with species detection.
Yeah, there is a company that's coming out that is doing your kind of stool analysis through the toilet seat, right? It's very basic, right? So and I jokingly referenced the Bristol stool chart, but the first bite of the apple is, hey, can we actually just get that at a regular, rather than just walking into a GI and trying to pick from a type 1 through type 7 on a chart and point something out, because people usually get it wrong. You can actually get that longitudinal view, and then doing things like being able to detect blood in the stool. Is it just a transient, hey, you had a bad weekend in Mexico? Or is it, hey, this is actually consistent, it's something you really need to get checked out? So it's an interesting technology using kind of, AI photo vision to be able to do that. Certainly it's going to be immensely difficult to get to the level of qPCR for diversity scores, but there are certain things that you could absolutely be able to solve for by having that kind of capability.
Oh, 100%. I mean, yeah, I think the blood or inflammatory kind of digestive, it'll start there. And then the sequencing would be kind of interesting to layer in, because until we really define, what should the human microbiome look like down to kind of a more species or even strain level. I mean, right now they're just still trying to figure out some of the phyla ratios. And that's why that to me is a more meaningful data point than an individual species detection, because we care about the general characteristics of a healthy microbiota. Like there was, when I redid my Biome Effects this past fall, and I hadn't done that specific test for like 3 years. But what was kind of crazy to me is my alpha diversity was almost exactly the same, like 3 years apart. I think it was like 163 back in maybe 2022, 2023. And then this past year, it was at like 165 or something like that, which is wild, because like I'm the kind of guy, I take probably like 4 different probiotics every day, plus 25 other nutraceuticals and botanicals and whatnot. So there kind of is this bigger question. Well, another big question of, there's the technology in reporting nuances, but also just our understanding of the microbiome in general, because with our microbiome sort of like getting its foot in the first 1,000 days of life, and largely influenced by the maternal microbiota and breastfeeding and antibiotic exposure and all of that, there's kind of this other question of like, well, if you had, damage done through dysbiotic risk factors early in life, those first, 3 years are in utero, like how much can you really improve upon it? We can always try to do our best to grow a healthy garden of microbes, but there is sort of that set point that maybe occurred early in life, and how much influence do we really have? We don't know.
Mm-hmm. I was just trying to grab I'll go find it in a minute. My history is not breastfed as a kid, chronic antibiotics. So it was, late 70s. It was the thing to do, is to put people on formula.
Yeah.
I was actually I was not able, and I'm still very reactive to US based cows. So I wasn't able to do like milk. So I was actually the original drinker of soy milk before soy milk was cool. So I don't know if anybody's ever had, in the 80s, you had to go to, it was a middle aisle and it came in a can, not these pretty boxes you see at Starbucks and stuff. Not that I would ever touch soy milk again, but it was a very odd thing, and it was seemingly perfectly normal. Chronic ear infections, and my pediatrician said just keep them on the pink stuff.
Yeah. Well, I mean, see, that's the kind of stuff that fascinates me so much with the kind of in utero microbiota and like the neurodevelopment. Like I was born to be a C-section, and I was literally purple when I came out. I was probably super hypoxic. And, I don't know, maybe we're both a little bit neurodivergent. The brilliance in me sees and honors the brilliance in you. And it's like, I don't know if that's a bad thing, but that is the kind of research that really fascinates me, of how, metabolic, the kind of metabolic status of the mother and microbiota status of the mother so heavily influences neurodevelopment through the neuroimmune crosstalk there. But, with like the human milk oligosaccharides that are in the breast milk and the colostrum and immunoglobulins, like so much of our immune maturation is being influenced by those maternal microbes, so to speak.
Yeah, it's there we go. So this is the normal. So you'll see kind of some transient variability here, but in general, so Akkermansia essentially always 0, except for recently, low, always below, low to 0. And, so I definitely kind of attribute that to, just developmental, microbiome just wasn't there. And so generally, as Jen jokingly says, my wife, my practitioner, jokingly says, I'm a good host. So I pick up gut bugs a lot easier than she does.
Mm-hmm. Well, and it's cool too. Like, you mentioned the different transient bugs. You think of like norovirus that, causes like, I had some food poisoning a few years ago, and I assumed it was norovirus. I wasn't going to test because it's so transient, it'll just pass through. And like with the GI map, I think PCR, especially the qPCR, like if I was just trying to identify a pathogen that I'm suspicious of, I'm probably going to go with qPCR. If I'm trying to get as much insight into their microbial ecosystem, I'm going to go with whole genome sequencing. And yeah, in an ideal world, it would be all of that plus all the biomarkers. But then you kind of mentioned it earlier in the Akkermansia just prompted, because then there's kind of the school of thought of like, well, if this microbe just wasn't detected as present, can I just supplement probiotically with that species? It's like, I really don't think it works that way at all. And I've seen plenty of cases where the Akkermansia being the prototypical example of, well, hey, there was no detectable Akkermansia on the GI map, so I will supplement with Akkermansia, but then still it's not there upon retest. Or when I was doing my BiomeFX for the second time, I was taking the Bifidobacterium longum, the 1714 and 35624, which is in their Zen Biome Dual. But then my test results showed no detectable Bifidobacterium longum at all. And that's with whole genome sequencing. So the nuances of technology is part of the conversation, but then like the precision of intervention, because we don't really have precise therapeutic strategies for the microbiota. You have to literally think of it more as like growing a healthy garden in your backyard. It's more about the gardening principles, not the like, well, here's the pill, the drug, the therapeutic that I put in to try to precisely take out this bug and leave all the others, just fine. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I mean, I'm kind of building on that gardening analogy. It's like you can fertilize all you want, but if there's no water coming in, still going to die, right?
Yeah.
Maybe shifting gears a little bit, let's talk about kind of the gut-brain axis and what you've been working on and how stool microbiome testing kind of relates. You kind of touched on a little bit about looking at neuroinflammation markers alongside of GI data, but I'd love to, everybody hears about the gut-brain axis, so maybe talk us through what you've been working on of late.
Yeah, I feel like I've been kind of deep in the gut-brain axis stuff for the past, 2-3 years in particular. I'm hoping I can kind of be done after this course that I just made, but it's such a big area, and my whole main area of focus is neuroimmune stuff, so the glial system of the brain. And so then everything that I do professionally is all in relation to how does this thing, whether it's mast cell activation or the microbiome or mitochondria or whatever, how does that relate back to altering the activity of the neuroimmune system? So when I am thinking of like root cause factors or subjects that are going to disturb the immune system of the brain and drive neuroinflammation that can then drive neuropsychiatric, neurodevelopmental, and neurodegenerative, it becomes kind of this, I always say the three pillars of mental health are microbiome, metabolism, and mindset. I definitely think, okay, kind of psychosomatic HPA, but the microbiome is really what creates the neuroimmune tone even early in utero, in early embryogenesis. So the microglial cells, which are the innate white blood cell, the innate immune cell of the central nervous system, scientists used to think that these were monocytes that had migrated into the functional tissue of the brain, but then they figured out completely different cellular origins. So whereas the monocytes come from bone marrow from hematopoietic origins, the microglia are from the yolk sac in early embryogenesis. And these microglia literally are kind of the primary cell regulating our neurodevelopment and the construction of our neural architectures in utero. And the microbiome of the mother and the developing fetus, it is those microbes that are essentially programming and maturing the neuroimmune cells, not just neuroimmune, but just the whole immune system. So that's kind of my favorite area, is looking at, well, how does the microbiota, whether we're talking in the context of in utero development for neurodevelopmental disorders, ADHD, autism, or more so like neuropsychiatric illness or preventing neurodegenerative disease, is there a way that we can holistically and meaningful modulate the microbiota composition in order to, like treat neuropsychiatric illness or prevent neurodegenerative disease? And that's kind of the $1 billion question. But that's a little synopsis of what I've been pretty deep in lately.
Awesome. I guess maybe we kind of glossed over this fact, the term leaky gut comes around all the time. There's zonulin testing. Where do you kind of think about leaky gut, maybe zonulin, and then even food sensitivities? We have some practitioners that are like, I don't run food sensitivities. It's all leaky guts. You fix the gut, you fix the sensitivities. Whereas other people are like, hey, food sensitivity is a great place to start because it's actionable day one. Whereas restoring the gut takes a longer time to do. Kind of give us your thought process around the whole leaky gut concept.
Yeah, I mean, the intestinal hyperpermeability, blood-brain permeability, super well established. But then the trick is, which markers are more reliable. Don't get me wrong, I do think, with some clinical critical thinking skills, like we can infer the likelihood of intestinal permeability and blood-brain permeability. However, the deeper I get into my career, the more strongly I feel about trying to avoid fear conditioning in the client or preventing a nocebo response, because we are assuming that they have scary things that they may not have, or we tell them that they have scary things that they may not have. And it was kind of a narrative based on data that lacks clinical significance. So that's kind of what we avoid. So for example, zonulin, fecal zonulin, there's some research, there's a big controversy in the literature about fecal zonulin measured by enzyme-linked immunosorbent assay, or ELISA. And some researchers are literally saying like, hey, that's not true zonulin. It's zonulin-related proteins. This marker is misleading the field of study of leaky gut, because we're just sort of blindly assuming that, hey, elevated zonulin indicates leaky gut, whereas that's really not established in the literature. However, that's what excites me is, well, just because it's not established yet, that gives us opportunity of like, let's explore, let's figure this out. And from a practitioner perspective, what I can say is I generally do see fecal zonulin trending with fecal calprotectin. So it's like, okay, a controversial data point with fecal zonulin, but if it's correlating really, really strongly with something very well established like calprotectin, well, to me, that indicates there's probably some degree of value there. But then there's a lot of other markers that we can use that would help us understand, is there inflammation and hyperpermeability, but then also is there the translocation and leakage of the scary things that we care about, the mycotoxins or the endotoxins. So for example, for specificity, if I see like elevated fecal calprotectin, okay, I know they have some degree of intestinal inflammation, But then if I look in the blood and I see that they have, elevated C-reactive protein, which is very IL-6 specific, and that can be related to the endotoxemia and the leakage of all those bug toxins. But then more specifically, something like procalcitonin, which is a clinical biomarker of basically sepsis, AKA endotoxemia. So then if I had like high calprotectin, high CRP, and high procalcitonin, I pretty much have mapped out, well, they have intestinal inflammation, they have leaky gut, they have endotoxemia, and it's driving systemic inflammation. So there is precision biomarker analysis that we can do, even if it's not a direct marker, but if there's a proxy marker that is still giving us the same story, essentially. So that kind of nuance gets exciting.
Yeah. And hey, question came in from YouTube from Hayden. Just wanted to just cover keystone species. So what are they? What does that mean? How do you interpret that?
Yeah, well, the keystone species, that's another, I'm glad that they asked. Because I would say, like, put the stool chemistries aside for a second. So throw out the physiological biomarkers. If we're just talking about microbiome sequencing and compositional data, the phyla ratios in my mind and the diversity metrics are kind of most important. But then next to that on the list would be the keystone species. So keystone species being called keystone because even though their quantity, their population within the ecosystem is not super high or large quantitatively, but their impact on the overall ecosystem health and stability is quite profound. So that's why they're called keystone species. And I don't know exactly how many there are, and they're probably kind of recategorizing them as they learn more about the microbiome in general. But some of the big ones that you hear about often would be like Faecalibacterium prausnitzii, which is a major butyrate producer, or Roseburia, another big butyrate producer, the Akkermansia muciniphila, which is from the Varicomicrobia phyla. So that's kind of like the fifth dominant phyla of the ecosystem. Oxalobacter formigenes that gets talked about a lot with, oxalate intolerance is one of the keystone species, or like Bifidobacterium longum as a big GABA producer. And there's a bunch more, but those are some of the major ones that are most cited.
So when you kind of, you get that test report back, how do you look at the keystone species and leverage that information?
Yeah, essentially, and I have like different test reports in my mind as I picture of like, I'm imagining some of the BiomeFX consults that I've serviced, and then, all the GI map consults I've serviced through FDN. So it's like I have all these kind of industrial compartments and experiences that I try to consolidate. But that's what has been so fun for me, is I'm just playing in the sandbox of functional medicine and trying to like make sense of it like the rest. But I do generally, it's like, well, I'm going to look at the phyla ratios and diversity metrics first. So in my head, I got the BiomeFX of the Firmicutes bacteroidetes phyla ratio, and then Proteobacteria to Actinobacteria, which is kind of an inflammatory clue because the Proteobacteria phyla is the phyla that houses a lot of the naughty lipopolysaccharide expressors like Klebsiella, for example. But once I've analyzed, alpha diversity, beta diversity, and phyla ratios, looking at the keystone species of what was detected, what was not. And then it depends. Is it, the whole genome sequencing, which is more just, was it present or not, versus the qPCR of, well, how much Akkermansia, how much Bifidobacterium. But then I'll look at that. The problem though, in all these consults that I've serviced, I've never had a great answer for it, because people ask, well, if I'm lacking this keystone species, how do I get more of it? How do I grow more of it, whether it's Akkermansia or any other? And that's kind of what inspired my comment of, we don't really have the precision, right? And of course, the default network would be like, well, just take an Akkermansia probiotic. And it's like, yeah, but what we really want to do is kind of the feed and seed, right? Ideally, we want to have enough population of that microbe, so it's exerting that key function, like producing vitamin K2, for example. We need a constant supply of K2, and sure, you could supplement with it, but what you really want is the microbes present to produce it. So it kind of brings us back to, well, we may not have the precision that we want or crave with intervention, but we do have the gardening techniques. And that's where it becomes kind of a coaching thing of teaching your clients how to grow and cultivate that healthy garden with diversity of diet, spending more time outside, managing their stress, avoiding dysbiosis risk factors, right? So it's more of a caring gardening model, not like an allopathic point and shoot model.
Yeah, and that was kind of my original comment around kind of the akkermansia oh, you're low in akkermansia, supplement the akkermansia.
Yeah.
But as Karan from Microbiome Labs, now doing a lot of different stuff, would always say is, it's an ecosystem, right? So the reason why akkermansia is low is it's being crowded out, right? And so just throwing more in there, it's still going to be crowded out. So how do you change that diversity over time to be able to enable that particular bacteria to proliferate? So I think leaf gardening is a great example.
Yeah, I think so too. I mean, that's why I have so much love and respect for Cron and all the work that they did through Microbiome Labs, because they really, I think, did a good job of modeling the terrain theory approach to the whole industry, as opposed to the just kind of chronic antibiotic, wipe the garden clean. And, there's a time and place. Obviously, there will be a time and place that antibiotics or antifungals are absolutely necessary. And even, I mean, I've seen, not to throw a wrench in, but muddy the waters, but I've even seen research that was looking at like post antibiotic treatment, whose microbiome basically bounced back faster, people that supplemented with probiotics and prebiotics versus just leave it alone and let it grow back. And I've seen some lines of evidence that said, like the probiotics post antibiotic intervention kind of made the repletion worse. And I'm just like, this is kind of where we have to humble ourselves with our lack of understanding of microbiome sciences and its exciting field research.
Yeah, 100% agree. It's one of those things where it's, we've got years and years of research on blood chemistry and all kinds of different applications, different clinical verticals, and stool microbiome testing has come to the marketplace relatively quickly, but it's also very hyperbolic in the claims that it's making, especially given the amount of how much more information there is in the gut that really is not well understood, right? And so that's kind of one of the things, is why I wanted to have this conversation and kind of peel it back to like, what is the reality of what you can actually do with a stool test, and what can you trust, and what do you need to avoid, right? Because there are companies out there that are selling stool kits to sell personalized supplements to consumers, and it's, is it really personalized, or are they just, you just shipping back some shit and then you're getting the same supplements that everybody gets? That's one of the frustrating things that we see coming out.
Yeah, I spend a lot of time kind of reflecting on just ethics in general and how I feel about some of these things and business practices, because, there's always going to be kind of a narrative and argument to make this point and whatnot. And it's like, okay, I mean, I guess as long as consumers and nobody's being harmed, first do no harm, right? So as long as nobody's being harmed, that's, fine and well to some extent, but it does get really convoluted quickly. And, something I was thinking about, it blows my mind. Like, there's so much microbiome research, and yet, conventional healthcare and pharma really hasn't touched the microbiome. They don't do anything with it. But I think the microbiome is a great example that kind of paints this picture of sort of conventional conservatism versus sort of functional early adopting behavior, where it's like, there's no conventional medical doctor that can deny that the microbiome is a thing and it's important for human health. But conventional medicine, there's no pharmaceutical that's going to magically like grow a beautiful garden in your colon, or even the fecal microbiota transplant research is, kind of inconsistent. That's not a very palatable thing. If nobody wants like a stool donation that's going to be put in their body, but those research models are really fascinating and compelling from the perspective of, how do we modulate the microbiome to get a therapeutic outcome? I know a startup that's trying to do like a postbiotic thing where they take, stool donors and they're extracting whatever they're extracting and encapsulating it. Well, it's like, but I was asking them like, but how do you get consistency of what is going to be in that capsule, because it's coming from all these various donors? So.
Yeah. It's a crazy time, but super interesting. We only got a couple minutes left. Just remind everybody where they can find you if they want to connect with you and learn more.
Yeah, I'm not too hard to find. The Holistics Avenue on Instagram. Website is metabolicsolutionsllc.com, and Biocanic and I will be collaborating on some cool posts about this series, so stay tuned for that.
Yeah, and next month we're gonna do your personal favorite, neuroinflammation. And you've been doing a lot of great presentations on that. So maybe just give a quick overview of kind of your focus.
Well, you guys are indulging me way too much with it, but I will take the opportunity because I never want to shut up about it. But yeah, I've really locked on to the microglial activation, neuroinflammation as kind of my main area of focus and fascination, just because like you can't be caught up on the research of mental health or neurodevelopmental or neurodegenerative without talking about the neuroimmune system. It's really kind of replacing the outdated model of just brain chemical imbalances. It's so much more than that when we look at the cytokines and the neurotrophic factors. So I'll be very excited to talk about neuroinflammation, neuroimmune activity, which shapes everything from the neurodevelopment we're born into the world, our mental neural health throughout life, and then neurolongevity, with the neurodegeneration being a major leading cause of death.
So awesome. Super excited. I know you won't have to prepare anything because you've been preparing for years on this topic. So it'll be fun to nerd out on that. So really appreciate it. Always great to catch up. And thanks everybody who joined us live. If you have questions, you're watching this later, drop them in the comments. We'll make sure to send them over to Brendan and get them answered. But thanks again, buddy.
Awesome. Thanks so much, brother. Appreciate you, man.
All right. See you guys.